Okay, time for some reassembly of our lathe headstock. So the first items to go in are these items here, which are the drive or the output drive for the quick change gearbox. So we've given the headstock cavity a good clean out, and before we get cracking on that, we just have to make a new gasket for these. There's two of those. What we need to do first is locate the holes. One. Two. Three. Okay, so we'll tap around the centre. And around the outside. Okay, I can trim that up now with the scissors. There we have our gasket. Okay, I've got one more to make for the other housing, so I'll make that one off camera. I'm going to do exactly the same, and then we'll head back over to the lathe. So we have an oil seal to press in our housing. Just like that. That's all it takes. Make sure he's all the way home. Okay. First operation is to get these two ball bearings pressed onto our output drive shaft. So we might head over to the press, I think, to do this operation. So we're going to use Hong Fuk Wong here as a press to press our two ball races onto our shaft. Now we're going to push down on that end. We need to support the bearing by the inner race. You don't want to be supporting it by the outer race. Where are we? If you press a bearing on by the outer race onto a shaft, you can damage the bearing. So I'm going to use a gear, one of the change gears, which picks up on the inner race, and that'll take the weight. So all of the weight will be on the inner race only. So that slips over there. Got to centralise it over the gear. See, I've got the weight on that, and see I can still spin the outer race. He's home. And repeat the process for the other bearing. Right, we'll get the shaft in. A bit of oil on the bearings, a little bit in the bore. Now remember, this is the one that when we went to take the gear off, we had to knock the shaft out. So I'll just start the shaft there and then we'll swing around and put the gear on. Okay, that's our shaft just there. So we have a spacer that goes on first, just this little spacer. Then there's the key, feather key, goes in there. Just put a drop of oil on the shaft. Now we should be able to slip our gear on, getting it the right way around and lining up the keyway. Okay, so I'll tap the shaft through now. Okay, let me just get a punch so I can just, oh, it's alright, I've got one here. We'll give this a couple of taps. Once again, we're hitting on the outside of the bearing because we're putting the bearing in a housing. We're not loading up the inner race. Okay. Now when I punch bearings in, I never ever use a brass or bronze drift or anything like that, or aluminium. I always use just steel, mild steel, 4140, whatever, chrome bar. The brass and the softer materials tend to chip material off, and they can lead to fragments going into your bearing. Okay, so we'll get our circlip. We've got a circlip to go on there while we've got the camera here. So we have our gasket to go on. Now I've given this gasket a slight smear coating in grease, because that's what I prefer to do with gaskets. And I've already put a little bit of oil on the lip of the seal. In it goes. Line it up with the Allen key. Bob's your auntie. Still spins. It's always a good thing. Okay, they're done. Right, we've got the other gear to go inside that runs on it. Okay, so we have this circlip to go on to retain it. Try again. Okay. That's on properly. Okay, next up, a bit of oil on this shaft here. And we have another gear. And there should be a spacer. And another circuit. Okay, that's it. You gotta love putting circlips on blind. Beautiful. Right, now we have our input drive shaft to go in next. Right, we need to press this bearing off and press the new one on, and this is the input drive shaft. So I'm just using any spacers that I've got lying around. If I had an arbor press, it would be perfect. Okay. Right, I'll go and dig out the new bearing and we'll fit the new bearing. Now if we look at the old bearing, something's been running on it. The shield is all pushed in on one side. Now nothing goes near it, so I don't really understand what's gone on there. So this is a dual shielded, double shield. It's got a shield on either side. This is our replacement bearing. I'm actually going to hook one of these shields out. So this side here will be internal into the headstock, and this will be the outside, and there's a cover and a lip seal runs on this side. You will get oil ooze out through these, so it'll be fine. This will just keep the bulk of the oil off the lip seal, and there'll just be enough in there to lubricate the lip seal. So we'll get this one pushed on. Okay, so with the new bearing, I found an aluminium spacer, so when we push it on, we're pushing on the inner race of the bearing only. Okay, she's home. Right, we'll get this mounted up in the headstock. Now we're actually going to put our bearing, get my hand into this bore first. Push him in. Okay. Bit of oil in the bearing. Now I'll just put a bit of oil down the shaft just to help things slip on a bit easier, and a bit in the bearing as well. So we have our shaft and the first gear to go in. Then there's a sleeve, the sleeve, lined up over the keyway. Okay. Next gear to go in is the smaller of the two gears. Now, I did look at seeing if I was able to clean up the worn faces on these gears, but it will end up doing more damage. So I opted to leave them as they are. We'll stick with my plan to run the machine for I think we'll get another 2 years out of them. And we'll deal with it then. By then we'll be over in the new shop and we can actually make replacement gears then, which we can't at the moment. Okay, that's everything on there. This one here's back on its try and give that a bit of a tap. Everything's there, it feels good. Okay. Right, now our next shaft to go in is this intermediate shaft here. So this has a bearing at either end. Where's the other? Yeah. So we've got bearings, a couple of gears, more gears, shaft, another bearing. So I think the way to tackle this one, which we have here, the shaft goes through the headstock, we have to feed the gears on and knock the bearings in. So I think what we'll do is we'll fit the bearing in the end here, then put the circlip in, and then we'll press the other bearing onto the shaft. Then we can slip the shaft through that way while feeding the gears on at the same time. Now, lucky I've got my little south bend because I've just knocked up the little piece of scrap and turned it down so I can tap this bearing into this bore here. So we'll get this one in. Always make a habit of putting the part numbers of the bearings to the outside whenever you can so you can see them, just for future reference later on. going good. We want it just in far enough to get that circlip on. I think that's him. Okay, circlip. I've mentioned this before with circlips. See if I can get a light. It won't. If you look at a circlip, they're stamped out. One side's rounder and one side's flat. Now, if I was to put this in with the rounded side out, it makes it quite easy. The circlip pliers quite often want to keep slipping out. Also, the thrust, any thrusting you get, it's going to go that way. So you want the flat side to retain that bearing properly. It's not too bad. There's not really any thrust on these, but in some circumstances there is. And that's when you want the flat of the circlip going in the same direction as the thrust. As if you fit the rounded edge in, the circlips can come out. I've seen them come out before. So we'll just slip this one in. And he's in. So what we'll do now is we'll press the other bearing onto this end of the shaft, and then we can assemble the shaft. So back over to Hock Fuck Wong. So we use our same sleeve as we did with the other bearing. Make sure it's centered. And we're on. We'll give it a squirt of oil. And on the other one as well. Okay, we'll get you set up in another spot. And we'll slip this shaft in, eh? Now the first gear, go in. Set him there. Roughly in position. Slip our shaft through. Now we have a circlip that has to go on the shaft about now. So this is where things get a bit tricky. If I had a small set of 90-degree external pliers, would make it life easy. Or just about. It's got them. Okay. So the next gear to go in place is this one here. So this has to go this way around. Okay, make sure our selectors are engaged, which they are. That circlip still has to go on a little bit further. Okay, the rear of the shaft is entered into the housing. I'll just give it a light tap. Okay, we're looking good. Now, because the bearings generally are tighter on the shaft than on the housing, I'm going to use this aluminium spacer and tap the inner race of the bearing. Make sure we're all still free. Yep. Looking good. That feels like we're there. And once again, just a slight tap on the rear of the other end of the shaft, just to centralise the bearings. Right, now we have an end cap to go on here. So under this side here, it's just an O-ring and a cap. It slips in, pushes home. That's it. Okay, well, I think next up we better look at our spindle bearings. Okay, a rear spindle cup. Quick wipe with a clean rag. In it goes. I've had these sitting in the freezer for 2 days. Just going to use the old bearing. Sort of make sure it's seated. Feels good. Lovely. Just want to get a bit of oil on them straight away. Okay, that's the rear one. Let's get the front one in. Okay, front one. Sounds seated. Beautiful. Same again. Okay, well I think next up we better have a look at the bearings on the spindle, the cones. Now you may have noticed then, I just put these bearings in and didn't take any notice of any markings on the bearings. That's because these are garden variety taper roller bearings, as is the ones that came out of the machine. Now we did try to track down a higher grade of bearing, but it's not the thing in Australia you can just go and get. They have to be specially ordered in from overseas. So that's not going to happen at this point in time. It ran fine with garden variety bearings before, and it will run fine with garden variety bearings now. Before I stripped it, I was doing a job a few weeks back, and I happened to have an indicator on the nose of the spindle, and I was getting nothing in regards to run out, nothing detectable on the taper on the front of the spindle nose, which is a good thing. So we'll see how it goes when it's reassembled. So what we need to do now is remove the bearings, the front bearing off the spindle, and then we can get that back in its situation, or back in its home hole. That's the one.